Right up front, we need to recognize, and maybe for some to accept, that what Matthew records the Magi seeing is a natural phenomenon, not a supernatural manifestation of God's glory like in a cloud that you see occurring in the Old Testament and sometimes in the New. Nor was it an angel that led them. I show these examples in Revelation where symbolically stars are talking about angels, or better said, heavenly beings, and also Jesus refers to himself as the bright and morning star at the very end of the book. So it's not very hard to present these verses in a way where one could say that this was much like the angel of Yahweh who led the Israelites out of Egypt. The main problem with that is that he has already been born on earth. And the wise men refer to the star as his, meaning that it represents his kingship. These magi were very well known throughout the ancient world and carried a lot of weight. Herodotus, in his famous Histories book, said that the Magi came from one of the 6 Median tribes. And when Cambyses, the son of Cyrus the Great, left for Egypt, is that he left a Magian in charge of his family. The famous Greek philosopher Democritus, as written by Diogenes Laertius, that he learned theology and astronomy from Magians. Strabo wrote that the Magi were living in Babylon and mainly were devoted to the study of astronomy, being composed of several astronomer groups. Strabo said earlier in his works that the Magi were even appointed as Parthian kings. Tacitus spoke about how Nero made Tiridates, the Magian, king in 63 AD. Pliny the Elder said that Mithridates, the Magian, brought an entourage with him when he went before Nero, and that they had initiated Nero into their esoteric banquets, with the added comment that Nero was trying to learn how to perform magic from them. And Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria said that the Magi were Persians who investigated the works of nature for the purpose of becoming acquainted with the truth. Do at their leisure become initiated themselves and initiate others in the divine virtues by very clear explanations. So here is the complete composite secular picture of who the Magi were and their high regard in the ancient world. And all of this mirrors Matthew's description. But what about verse 2's star in the east that they saw? The main Greek word here is Anatole, which can be referring to the cardinal direction, just like with the Magi coming from the east. It can also be talking about the early morning hours shift from dark to light. Interesting that Zechariah refers to the unborn Messiah as Anatole from on high in his prophecy. But it can also be referring to the celestial rising of stars and planets in the east. The most preferred lexicon today is BDAG, because of the 4 authors' last names, has as its first entry on Anatole that verse 2 deals with rising because of the preposition and the article, in contrast to verse 1 about the Magi's geographical journey. So verse 2 is speaking about an astronomical rising. Now, if that was confusing, what they more simply meant was, if Matthew wanted verse 2 to be speaking about geographic location, then Matthew would have wrote it in the same manner that he did in verse 1. Contemporary to Matthew was Philo, who used Anatello when describing celestial objects rising, which is why more modern versions will say rose or rising of the star that the Magi saw. I like the NSRV wording by saying that the Magi observed its rising, which is exactly what astronomers do. And all of this fits as Herod was probing them about when exactly they saw the star appear at its rising. Knowing that these astronomers were looking at a natural celestial event begs the question of why did whatever they saw trigger in them that that's the sign for that messianic king of the Jews was now born? Or maybe better worded, where do they even learn such a thing? Because they are pagans after all. Well, by looking at the secular description of the Magi, is that you can see that they are Babylonian and Medo-Persian rooted. In the time that they would have encountered and been interacting with Jews on a continuous basis was during the Babylonian exile period. But when Cyrus led all of those in captivity to freely return to their homeland, is that just over 50,000 Jews actually did go back. This is most likely a very small percent of the total population, like say 10%. So a high majority of the Jews remained in the Babylonian Persian territory and would have been easily still continued to interact with the Magi for the subsequent centuries. But where, or from whom, what have they learned about the Jewish Messiah can only be found in one book in the Old Testament, and that is Daniel. 8 times Magos is found in the Septuagint, and all of them are in Daniel, while he was in Babylon during the exile and working in Nebuchadnezzar's and Belshazzar's court. Oh wow, the critics aren't going to like this, as it only points towards early authorship. And as you can see, is that these astrologers were connected with and to the Chaldeans, just like Strabo said in his description. The 2 things to take note of is first, Daniel 1:20's comment that Nebuchadnezzar found Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego 10 times better than the Magi who were currently in office. But the more important one is the episode in chapter 2 with the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue of multiple metals. And after the utter failure of the Babylonian Magi is that Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was and its meaning. And as shown on the chart, is that this is when the Magi got their first lesson in who Yahweh is, and what, and when, his kingdom will be installed on earth. And after Daniel aced this test, is that then the king made Daniel a great and gave him many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. So you see, Daniel would have been telling these guys all about Yahweh of Israel and how one day he will set up his kingdom on earth. But where does the astronomical connection come in? Well, Daniel would have given them a little Torah lesson about the time when the pagan prophet Balaam blurted out his 4th prophecy on Israel, saying, "There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth. And Edom shall be a possession, Seir also shall be a possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly. Out of Jacob shall come he that shall have dominion, and shall destroy him that remaineth of the city." Right there is your star language connected to the coming Messiah of the Jews. And Daniel would have explained to them that this figure was prophesied by Jacob to come from the tribe of Judah and a descendant of the Davidic kings, but also that this figure was to be the Son of God. And the tethering of Psalm 2 with Numbers 24:17 and Genesis 49:10 perfectly connects together because of the royal scepter and rod language for the messianic king of the Jews. Daniel would then continue to explain that Judah is represented by the lion. Daniel, the Babylonian Magi, and subsequent astronomers would easily connect these thoughts together and astronomically be thinking of the Leo constellation. Now, before you go thinking that I'm saying that the Bible is endorsing astrology and horoscope reading that ultimately leads to fatalism, is that I am not. The Old Testament is clear that this practice is forbidden because it's idolatry, because it's directly connected to the worshiping of pagan gods. But straight astronomy by itself is not prohibited. There's actually quite a bit of it in the Old Testament, starting right at the beginning with creation, as God said that the stars and lights in the sky were created with the purpose of serving as signs. And they do serve as signs with the day of the Lord judgment with them by not giving their light. All you have to do is go see the book of Joel as well for the clearest portrayal of this. Both Isaiah and the psalmist say that God names all of the stars, which is part of God's response to Job, in that he is the one who arranged the stars in their constellations, with some of them being part of the 12 signs of the zodiac, called the Matzerah in Hebrew. Job earlier said that God is the one who made the constellations. The chambers of the south verse, or quote there in verse 9, could be in reference to the Southern Cross. Job later made reference to the crooked or fiery serpent in the heavens that could be a reference to the constellation Draco, the dragon. Amos 5:8 says that God is the one who made the 7 stars. Now, the 7 stars in the KJV is also the same word in Job 9:38 for Pleiades. But if Amos is referring to the 7 largest visible lights in the sky, is that this would be referring to the sun, moon, and the 5 planets that can be seen with the naked eye. These would be understood as wandering stars, as they appeared to move throughout the constellations and weren't fixed in a fixed motion, or stationary like the North Star. You can see Ptolemy's 7 planetary spheres that he used in his geocentric model in the 2nd century AD. Now, back to the Bible, is that Psalm 19 says that the heavens declare the glory of God. They utter speech and show knowledge and have a voice. So, we have 4 statements that say that the heavens teach us theological insight in some manner. I repeat, we are not talking about horoscope reading, fortune telling, or fatalism here. Verse 4. Their line goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. In them hath he, God, set a tabernacle for the sun. This is in reference to the ecliptic, an apparent line that the sun appears to travel on throughout the year as it moves through the 12 zodiacal constellations. Each month, the sun appears within a given constellation, as each zodiacal sign is given 30 degrees, but the ancients saw this as the sun covering it or clothing it. And before this, the psalmist said that God ordained all of them, i.e., put them in order and motion, so that they would serve as signs to the ancient Israelites, as said in Genesis 1:14. Now, this might sound convincing to some of you out there, but to others, I still can imagine that some of you are thinking that I'm just taking this in the direction that I want. I am not, because there have been numerous zodiacs found in the remains of 1st century Jewish synagogues in Palestine that demonstrates that the Jews were observing the heavens for insight. So, when Daniel was explaining to the Magi about the Messianic king's future coming, is that he connected it to the Leo constellation that represents the tribe of Judah, and all of them would immediately think about Regulus, the brightest star in the Leo constellation, that is known as the king star in every ancient Near Eastern culture. Now, this is a starting point for the Magi, but Regulus was not the star as verse 9 describes the star continuing to move before the Magi, and that it stopped over top of Bethlehem. Regulus appears to be constantly moving from its rising in the east to its setting in the west. So this description simply does not fit the bill with what the Magi are describing. But we can safely know that Regulus and the Leo constellation are part of the equation. And because they are, is that the 7 BC proposal of the triple conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter are thrown out because in each instance, Jupiter and Saturn's conjunction with one another do not even come close to taking place in the Leo constellation. A reply might be that the conjunction is in the Pisces constellation, or the fish constellation, and since Jesus is the fisher of men, that this somehow works. But one's own dreamed up rationalization does not and will never overrule what Scripture says. And Genesis 49 and Numbers 24 are quite clear on the matter. So, the 7 BC conjunctions fail both chronologically and scripturally. The Magi would not even consider them to be the sign that the Jews' Messiah had been or was about to be born. But this does bring up the idea of when would the Magi have expected to be looking for a celestial sign that the Jewish Messiah was about to be born. Conjunctions happen regularly enough, so they would have had a general time frame in mind to think, okay, that's the celestial sign, and it does fall within the expected window for the Messiah's coming. And that takes us right back to Daniel in chapters 7 through 9. Chapter 7's 4 beasts perfectly align with the statue in chapter 2. And the fourth empire is Rome, as they were the ones who conquered the Greek Empire and its 4 sub-kingdoms. Whether you agree with this interpretation or not is that it does not matter, because those in the first century did, like Josephus stating right here that Rome was the 4th predicted empire. And just to add a little salt into the critic's wound, is that Josephus was an early dater of the book of Daniel. Now, chapter 7 is quite clear that the inauguration of God's kingdom will be led by the Son of Man going out and conquering the 4th empire and its little horn ruler. This figure, the Son of Man, is the Messiah, as all the descriptions link together with one another. Chapter 8 comes into play with its prediction of a little horn rising up within the Greek Empire, which was ultimately fulfilled with Antiochus Epiphanes IV. But the distinction between chapter 7's little horn and chapter 8 is quite clear and apparent, as it prevents the equivocation that critics try to make between the two. Chapter 8 is also important as it shows that Daniel's vision of the ram and goat were astronomical signage of the Persian and Greek empires. This is further validation that celestial signage is biblically okay as long as it's rooted in God's Word. Chapter 9, 70 weeks, is the main chronological determinant that the Magi would have been using to get a general time frame for the Messiah's arrival. Of the 6 points, the everlasting righteousness language tethers itself to chapter 2's and 7's description of the everlasting kingdom that will be ushered in upon its conquering of the 4th empire. And when you tack on the 490 years from the 70 weeks, is that your window for the Messiah's arrival is between the late 1st century BC and the early 1st AD. And that's working with a modern chronology system in mind. Critics and rabbinic Jews are not going to like that I'm applying the 70 weeks to the Messiah. But sorry, you have a 1st century secular source problem to overcome. Suetonius, in his book on Emperor Vespasian, wrote that a firm persuasion had long prevailed throughout all the East, that it was fated for the empire of the world at that time to devolve on some who should go forth from Judea. This prediction referred to a Roman emperor, as the event showed, but the Jews applied it to themselves. The references makes it clear that the Jews were thinking of the Fourth Empire's destruction at the time using the 70 weeks prophecy. Tacitus also said that various portents had occurred at this time, that is around 70 AD, but so sunk in superstition are the Jews and so opposed to all religious pagan practices that they think it wicked to avert the threatened evil by sacrifices or vows. Most people held the belief that, according to the ancient priestly writings, this was the moment at which the East was fated to prevail, and that they would now start forth from Judea and conquer the world. This enigmatic prophecy really applied to Vespasian and Titus, but men are blinded by their hopes. The Jews took to themselves the promised destiny, and even defeat could not convince them of the truth. Again, this is a clear demonstration that the Jews were expecting God's promised kingdom to come in and conquer the Roman Empire at this time. And this can only come from Daniel 2, 7, and 9. And Josephus confirms this belief as well, with the prophecy being fulfilled with the destruction of the city and the temple from Daniel 9:26. But the first century Jews also believed from their sacred writings how, about that time, one from their country should become governor of the whole earth. And earlier in our discussion on Augustus's oath is that there was an allusion to the 70 weeks made by Josephus when he described the Pharisees telling the people that Herod's government was prophesied to be destroyed. And prior to this, you have the Essenes, who were very likely the Qumran community who harbored the Dead Sea Scrolls, writing in what is called 11Q Melchizedek. They cite Isaiah 61:1 with the Messiah proclaiming liberty to the captives and tying that verse to Melchizedek, who is only found in Psalm 110 outside of Genesis 14. They say that he will forgive and atone for his people. Then ties this figure to Elohim, who sits in the divine council from Psalm 82. And here comes the Daniel 9 reference. Your Elohim reigns. Its interpretation, the mountains are the prophets, and the messenger is the anointed one of the Spirit, concerning whom Daniel said, until an anointed one, a prince, from Daniel 9:25. Right there is your 70 weeks Messiah interpretation prior to Christianity. And then they wrap more of Isaiah 62 around this figure as the one who will proclaim the gospel with the final line that flat out calls him God. You would almost swear that this meshing of these four passages together was done by a Christian, but in fact was coming from a Jewish community over 100 years prior to Jesus. And in a different article of Wacholder's is that he wrote about how all the early 1st century AD messianic movements were tied to the 70 weeks prophecy. All of this demonstrates that the Magi would have known the general window of time to expect the Messiah's arrival. And then all they would need to do was to look up into the sky during this time for celestial signage in the Leo constellation to alert them that the Messiah's arrival had occurred. Now, with this window of time in mind, is that we can narrow our scope down considerably because Herod's massacre of the innocent was with all boys 2 and under in Bethlehem at the time based upon what he got out of the Magi when he asked specifically, when did the star appear? This settles the discussion on the interpretation of Paideon in Matthew. Luke's story is about baby Jesus, while Matthew 2 is referring to toddler Jesus being about a 2-year-old at the time of the Magi's arrival, which matches Luke's 3 BC birth date, as this points to the star's appearance in 3 BC as well. with the Magi's arrival coming shortly before Herod's death. All of this demonstrates a perfect harmonization of Luke's and Matthew's accounts. Luke 2 occurs during the fall of 3 BC, while Matthew 2 picks up in late 2 BC, before the January 10th, 1 BC eclipse, with Herod's death occurring shortly thereafter, with Joseph and Mary returning from Egypt and moving back to the city of Nazareth in the summer of 1 BC, after the Jewish revolt had been stopped by the Roman army, after Herod's funeral around the Passover season. Now, I got a feeling that some of you, likely critics, are saying, but that timeline creates a contradiction between Luke's and Matthew's accounts, because Luke says that they went home after 40 days, while Matthew makes it sound like the Magi showed up right when Jesus was born. Well, we've already shown that Herod's own words negate that with the to and understatement. And this is an instance when the Old Elizabethan isn't the best wording for us to go off of. We simply have a conjunction here. What should be driving this is that genao is inflected in the aorist tense, meaning past tense. And because of Herod's words, the Magi's, and the Paideon description is that modern versions will say either after Jesus was born or now after Jesus was born, denoting that some amount of time had passed, as this comes right off of 1:18 through 25's birth narrative that was focused around Joseph's experience, while Luke's centers around Mary's. We know the story well with him wanting to divorce Mary secretly, but Gabriel says, don't, she hasn't cheated on you, but she's bearing the Messiah inside of her right now. And from that, Joseph took Mary as his wife, but waited until Jesus was born that he and her would consummate their marriage. So, there is a span of time involved between the close of chapter 1 and the start of chapter 2. So, Matthew 1's events, with Joseph in focus, occurred sometime between John's birth and the census mandate that made them go to Bethlehem. So chronologically, it goes Luke 1, Matthew 1, Luke 2, then Matthew 2. Both accounts are still in perfect harmony with one another, which maybe you have now started to realize that Luke and Matthew are describing two different times that Mary went to Bethlehem. But why would she be there twice? I'm sorry, but if that really sounds like a contradiction to you, then you are desperately grasping at straws to make the two accounts sound like they're contradictory to one another. Have you ever gone to the same town twice in your life? Yeah. So you already see, kind of how foolish this line of thinking is. But why was she there? I mean, it just sounds like Matthew is putting her and Jesus back into Bethlehem, so it's fulfilling Micah 5:2 to them. Wrong again. There's a really good reason for Mary to be back in Bethlehem at this time. But since we don't know what time that is quite yet, is that I can't reveal it to you. And that's where the star does come back into our discussion. Because the Magi and Herod informed us that the star appeared in 3 BC. So, the simple question is, was there any celestial signage in the Leo constellation with Regulus in 3 BC? And the answer is, oh yeah, it lit up like the 4th of July. And it started with the star's helical rising in the east, as Herod was asking for the specific time that the star appeared. Helical rising, or star rising, of a star occurs annually when it briefly becomes visible above the eastern horizon at dawn just before sunrise, after it has spent a season behind the sun, rendering it invisible. So you can see how this matches the description from the Magi and Herod. Michael Molnar, in his work on the Magi and the star, confirms this. Molnar says that the star was Jupiter and its helical rising on April 17, 6 BC in the Aries constellation. Remember that the ancients saw the 5 visible planets as wandering stars. And it makes total sense that Jupiter, the king planet, is the star that the Magi were referring to, as it's the 3rd brightest object in the night sky behind the moon and Venus. I think most know that Jupiter was the king god of the Roman pantheon and the equivalent to Zeus in the Greek pantheon. The planet was also called the star of Jupiter and meant to the Greeks as the shining one or blazing star. Molnar confirmed Matthew's wording to be stock astronomical wording for heliacal risings in the ancient world. How you know that it was Jupiter's annual rising was if it preceded the sun by 12 degrees. Now, Molnar picked April 17, 6 BC because he was working off of a 4 BC date for Herod's death. He also looked into the numismatic coinage of the day and saw connections between Aries and Herod's territory. As you can see in the picture, is that Jupiter is 12 degrees away from the sun at sunrise on April 17, 6 BC in the Aries constellation. But Molnar's view fails because he is working off of the wrong year for Herod's death, and scripturally, we know that the star needs to be connected with the Leo constellation, and also that Daniel has already connected the Persian Empire with the Aries constellation. In 5 BC, Jupiter's heliacal rising was in the Taurus constellation. Then, in 4 BC, it was in the Gemini constellation. Does anyone want to take a guess on which one it rose in 3 BC? That's right, the Leo constellation. Now, if you have some goosebumps with this, just wait, because it's going to get pretty cool from here. But just to show is that in 2 BC, Jupiter's heliacal rising was in the Virgo constellation. Now, going back to the August 1st, 3 BC rising, is that it's perfect, as it's right when we expected the Roman census, i.e. the oath mandate, to have been conducted in Judea. Now watch what happens in the next 11 days. Venus and Jupiter form a conjunction on August 12th. Then Jupiter continued toward the Leo constellation and joined Regulus on September 14th, 3 BC, right in the window that Luke described Jesus' birth taking place in. But the show was far from over, as Jupiter appears to reverse course and joins again with Regulus on February 17th, 2 BC. But just keep watching, because Jupiter again appears to reverse course, and for a 3rd time joins with Regulus on May 8th, 2 BC. This back and forth could have been interpreted by the Magi as some type of crowning effect over Regulus. But the show wasn't over, as Jupiter remained in Leo, is that then Venus appeared to be closing in on it again on June 17th, 2 BC, and on the ground level, they would have fused together as a single object and became the brightest sign that the Magi would have ever seen in the West. Guys, the great conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter that we just had on December 20th, 2020, pales in comparison to this. And actually, we could see, a Jupiter Venus one coming up soon on February 11th and 12th, 2021, if you like to go out and see it in the night sky. But in regards to the June 17th, 2 BC one, is that you would need elvish eyes to see the 0.04 degree separation between the two. Robert Sinnott wrote in Skying Telescope that this would have been a brilliant double star, and the fusion of the 2 planets would have been a rare and awe-inspiring event. And at this point, the Magi would have known that it was time to pack up the camels and head to Jerusalem. Now, all this celestial signage was obvious to them, and now to us as well. But if you're still hesitating on the idea of Jupiter as the star, because it sounds a little too pagan to you, is that you need to put the whole Greek and Roman side of this whole thing out of your head and put in what the Hebrews refer to it as. And that is Zedek, which means righteousness. Shay Tucker wrote a nice, concise article on the Hebrew names of the planets that can be found on Cambridge's website. He points out that in Hebrew astronomy, that they too understood the planets as walking stars, and Jupiter was named Zedek by the Hebrew astronomers. Tucker references a tradition that talked about Jupiter shining during Abraham's battle in Genesis 14 with Chedorlaomer. The tie-in piece for us with that story is the reference to Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of El Elyon, who blessed Abraham. Melchizedek's last part of his name is Zedek, and this name only gets brought up in one other place in the Old Testament, and that is in Psalm 110. And that is in reference to the second Lord in the scene, who sits to the right hand of the first Lord. And as said, Melchizedek is composed of two words, Melech and Zedek. Melech is the word for king, so Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Now take this back in our celestial signage discussion. You would have righteousness rising in Leo on August 1st, 3 BC, in the Magi's eyes, and with the three Regulus and Jupiter conjunctions, is that since Regulus is the king star, is that Melech and Zedek would be joining over and over again. That would evoke Melchizedek from Psalm 110 to ring in their heads. Now, if you think that I'm forcing the issue here, just hold on. But before this is that if you were wondering how in the world did it look like Jupiter was moving back and forth in the sky like that, is because of the illusion of what is called retrograde motion. This happens when two planets, in our case Earth and Jupiter, come in opposition of one another. Our two orbits here show the Earth currently behind Jupiter in its orbit around the Sun, kind of like, two track runners running in their lanes. But since we, the Earth, are closer to the Sun, is that we eventually appear to catch up to Jupiter. This goes for other planets as well. If we look straight at Jupiter, is that it looks like it's, right beside the given clip art blue star. But as Earth catches up to Jupiter, is that the new line of sight makes Jupiter now appear to be moving away from that blue star. This apparent movement would continue to be observed in the subsequent days and months. So, us Earth dwellers, including the Magi back then, would see Jupiter wandering back and forth in the sky, regardless if you're under the ancients' geocentric mindset or today's Copernican heliocentric one. So, just to see this in a smooth transition, here you go. And putting Leo in the background is that you can see the example now moving forward and backward around Regulus. And that's why Molnar has Jupiter zigzagging on the Aries coin with its description of dates when Jupiter appeared to reverse course. But going back to our 3-2 BC display is that you can see the same apparent forward, then backward, then forward again movement of Jupiter around Regulus. And this explains the Magi's description of the star, i.e. Jupiter, that continued to move before them. But Then it came to a stop by standing over top of Bethlehem. So, continuing on from June 17th to BC, is that you see a clustering of planets on August 26th. Could have this meant anything to the Magi? Yeah, hard to say because nothing in Matthew indicates that. Mercury was the messenger of the gods, the equivalent of Hermes to the Greeks, and Mars being the god of war, equivalent to Ares. So, maybe it's possible, but I personally am not going to make too much out of this. But it is worth showing that there were other planetary conjunctions and clustering going on that could have meant something to the Magi, especially with their pagan background. But after the third conjunction of Jupiter and Regulus on May 8th, 2 BC, is that Jupiter continued to move forward in the sky, meeting with Venus on June 17th. Then we see that clustering on August 26th. And as it kept moving forward, is that at this point, we are looking for the retrograde to kick in. Can you see it? It started to move back right at the end of December into BC. Let's go back a little bit and see it in slow-mo, with it seeming to stop just like the Magi said it did in verse 9 on December 25th, 68 degrees above the southern horizon, directly over top of Bethlehem. Guys, even the History Channel acknowledges this movement. Recognizing the retrograde motion in Matthew 2:9 is the ultimate death blow to any comet or supernova view, and it solidifies that Jupiter is 100% what the Magi were tracking on. Now, if you're a person like me, you would like to know when was the last time that so much celestial signage took place, since conjunctions repeat over time. Prior to 2 BC, is that the last time there was a triple conjunction of Regulus and Jupiter was 12 years before this in 1514 BC, and prior to that, 71 years earlier in 8685 BC. This pattern repeats over time. So we can add 71 years onto 32 BC to get 6970 AD, which just so happens to be the span when Jerusalem was getting destroyed by the Romans under Titus. Working on the prior side is that your heliacal risings occur in the Cancer constellation in 15 BC, but then in Leo on August 28th, 14 BC, after the triple conjunction that had already occurred. Venus and Jupiter conjunctions do happen near this time, but only one of them is in the Leo constellation. On the after side is that your heliacal rising in Leo is August 5th, 1080. It's a little smoother as a single conjunction occurs 3 weeks later with a Venus conjunction occurring nearly a year later. The bottom line is that neither side even comes close to the 2 BC, which only adds to the idea that the Magi would have seen the 2 BC heavenly show more telling and significant than all the other years that they had observed. And just to bring up another possible wrinkle for the Magi knowing that 2 BC is 100% fulfilling Genesis 49 and Numbers 24 right before their eyes, is that Daniel's 70 weeks window could be narrowed down even further with a couple extra, very permittable, steps on the chalkboard. First is that we can eliminate the first two as nothing celestial significantly was going on and from those time periods, so we can just get rid of them. The last two, however, is that we can do some reversing back by first recognizing that Daniel 9:25 has the Messiah's arrival at the end of 69 weeks, not the full 70. So instead of adding 490, you could just add 483, 1 week of years less. That gives you a 27 to 29 AD span. And if, and I do mean if, the Magi would have taken into consideration that Jewish priests could enter into work in the tabernacle at 30 years old, and that the Messiah was to be a priest in the Melchizedek order, is that 30 more years could be additionally subtracted off, creating a 4 BC to 9 AD window for the Messiah's birth to occur in. Now, with Jupiter looking as if it stopped right over top of Bethlehem from the Magi's perspective, starting on December 25th, is that it takes us back to the discussion of why Mary was back in Bethlehem for a second time. Well, it was for a pretty good reason. She was there because she was celebrating Hanukkah, the festival that celebrates the rededication of the temple after Antiochus Epiphanes IV desolation of it. You actually find Jesus celebrating this in John 10 in Jerusalem, and includes the note that it occurred during the winter period. Now, Josephus discussed the festival and its backdrop, but adds that the festival is called the Festival of Lights. You even have the winter solstice going on, signifying the rebirth, dawn, or rising of the sun over the darkened season as it stands still in the sky. This is important because it takes us back to our discussion about Anatole. We mentioned earlier that some Old Testament passages had God being called a son, and Malachi 4:2 said that the Messiah would have healing in its wings, calling him the Son of Righteousness. But did you catch the rising language that's embedded in there? In the Septuagint translation of Malachi 4:2 is that it uses anatello that's most often associated with the rising of the sun, or you could say at dawn. The 3rd BC Jewish translators also use this with Numbers 24:17 with the messianic star rising out of Jacob, which makes all the more sense with Zechariah calling the unborn Messiah the Anatole from on high, or Peter calling Jesus the day star that arises in our heart, and Jesus referring to himself as the bright and morning star, which is what Jupiter's heliacal rising was on August 1st, 3 BC. All of this is rooted in the Old Testament and is connected even more together by the Septuagint translators as they take the messianic passages referring to him as the branch who will come from David in Jeremiah 23:5, Zechariah 3:8 and 6:12, and Ezekiel 29:21's horn that will bud forth. It's interesting how the translators took the plant imagery here and translated them with Greek celestial wording. But it makes more sense when you're connecting all these ideas together about the Messiah coming from David's line. This imagery can also be found in Isaiah 11:1 with the shoot that will come out from Jesse, the father of King David. All of these get essentially referenced in Hebrews 7:14 when it says that Jesus sprang up out of the tribe of Judah. This invariably gets the brain thinking about chapters 7 through 12 in Isaiah with all of the prophecies about the coming Messiah, including the virgin birth, and this slingshots us to Isaiah 60 with all the imagery of the Messiah being a light unto the Gentiles and the kings of the earth, with verse 6 saying, "The multitude of camels shall come over thee, the dromedaries of Midian and Ephah, and they from Sheba shall come, they shall bring gold and frankincense, and they shall show forth the praises of the Lord." And this is why the wise men were so fired up, because all of the Old Testament prophecies were being fulfilled right before their eyes, with the star now in the Virgin constellation sitting right over top of Bethlehem during the Festival of Lights. And they were even fulfilling Isaiah 66 by bringing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh unto Jesus. Now, before closing out with the exact date for Jesus' birth, is that the critic might try one final counter to Matthew's account, with the closing piece about Herod killing all the boys 2 and under in Bethlehem, and that this is somehow not historically reliable. Basically, the critic's whole approach is an argument from silence because Josephus didn't mention it, therefore Matthew and the Bible can't be trusted. I'm sorry, but that's just really poor reasoning, especially from everything that we have shown so far in Matthew and Luke's accounts. The only relevant question to ask is whether or not this could have happened. And the answer is most assuredly yes. Knowing that the Magi's visit occurred in late December of 2 BC actually makes Josephus's and Matthew's accounts complement each other even more. On our timeline is that we can see that Matthew's Magi account during Hanukkah comes right before Herod's killing of Matthias and the others for ripping down the Roman eagle on top of the temple gate in conjunction with the January 10th, 1 BC blood moon. Now, before closing out with the exact date for Jesus' birth, is that the critic might try one final counter to Matthew's account, with the closing piece about Herod killing all the boys 2 and under in Bethlehem, and that this is somehow not historically reliable. Basically, the critic's whole approach is an argument from silence because Josephus didn't mention it, therefore Matthew and the Bible can't be trusted. I'm sorry, but that's just really poor reasoning, especially from everything that we have shown so far in Matthew and Luke's accounts. The only relevant question to ask is whether or not this could have happened. And the answer is most assuredly yes. Knowing that the Magi's visit occurred in late December of 2 BC actually makes Josephus's and Matthew's accounts complement each other even more. On our timeline is that we can see that Matthew's Magi account during Hanukkah comes right before Herod's killing of Matthias and the others for ripping down the Roman eagle on top of the temple gate in conjunction with the January 10th, 1 BC blood moon. So you already have Herod burning priests and others alive at this time. But what inspired them to take such action, because they knew what the consequence would be? And this is where Matthew's account ties in, because when the Magi arrived a couple of weeks before this, is that the whole city would have seen the entourage coming in and been really curious and excited about their presence. And the Magi would have been telling everyone why they had come. It wouldn't have been a concealed secret only for Herod. And we know this because verse 4 says that all Jerusalem was shook up by the news that the Messiah had been born. I think by now we know that messianic fever was high at this time, and this type of news would have easily inspired people to start rebelling against the Roman government, including Herod. And let's not forget that very soon after this, Herod kills his own son and heir to the throne, Antipater, because he believed Antipater was trying to assassinate him for the throne. Herod was paranoid all the time about insurrection and assassination attempts. And we saw earlier that the Pharisees were using Daniel's prophecies as inspiration that Herod's kingdom would be overthrown. And Herod killed them and even other family members of his that bought into this idea. All of this gels perfectly with the Magi's arrival and their news that the Jewish Messiah had been born. Herod tried to use the Magi as trackers so he could go kill the toddler, but God warned them to get out of Bethlehem, and Herod found out that he had been duped by them, is that then he lost it, no differently than all the other occasions that we read in Josephus's accounts, and he ordered that all the boys 2 and under in Bethlehem should be killed. All of this perfectly harmonizes chronologically and contextually with Josephus. There is absolutely no reason to discount the idea of Herod killing a few dozen 2 and under boys in a poor shepherding town like Bethlehem. Herod was a massacring nut job from day one, with Antigonus all the way to his last days by executing his very own son. He took out anyone and everyone at the first sniff of a rebellion. What even further validates Matthew's narrative is that Suetonius, writing on Augustus, said, according to Julius Marthus, a few months before Augustus was born, an astronomical portent was generally observed at Rome, which gave warning that nature was pregnant with a king for the Roman people. Thereupon, the Senate in consternation decreed that no male child born that year should be raised. But those whose wives with child saw to it that the decree was not filed in the treasury, since each one appropriated the prediction to his own family. Right there, you have the Roman Senate ordering that all male babies born that year essentially should be killed, because astronomical signage was being interpreted to say that a king of the Romans was going to be born that year. And coincidentally enough, the man who completed the dissolving of the Roman Republic into an empire was born that very year. So, altogether, we have conclusively shown that both Matthew's and Luke's opening 2 chapters are 100% historically reliable. There is absolutely no reason to consider them a mythical fabrication in any regard. Now, on to the actual birth date of Jesus. All the scriptures in Matthew and Luke point towards a September 3 BC timeframe. I have seen proposals of using the Great Conjunction of Venus and Jupiter on June 17, 2 BC as the birth date, and those advocates' reasoning is that 9 months before this was the first conjunction of Regulus and Jupiter. I know this looks really nice, but no. There are too many textual and historical barriers to try and place the birth in June of 2 BC. The biggest of which is that the census was conducted between August and October of 3 BC, and also that the Roman Senate bestowed Augustus with the new title on February 5th, 2 BC. The birth took place during the time that the census was being conducted, and its mandate to make Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem was ultimately fulfilling Micah 5:2 in this. June 17, 2 BC is 4 months after all of that would have been completed, and it goes against what Matthew and Luke said. We have shown that from both ends that Luke places the birth in September of 3 BC, with Jesus' ministry starting in the spring of 28 AD. John the Baptist's birth pointed to it on the front end, with Tiberius' 15th year being shown to be the Tishri to Tishri span of 27-28 AD. And on the back end, Paul's chronology was established by starting with Gallius' proconsulship in 51 AD and seeing that the Jerusalem Council took place in 48 AD, is that this allowed us to rewind the clock back 17 years to 32 AD for Paul's conversion and seeing that the crucifixion most likely occurred in 30 AD. And from this established Lucan chronology is that the September 3 BC timeframe was confirmed further by Matthew as the dates perfectly align with Herod killing all the boys 2 and under. So, we're very positive from Matthew and Luke that Jesus' birth was in September of 3 BC. But we want to know the exact date, and currently the best we could guess in that month is Jupiter's first conjunction with Regulus on September 14th, 3 BC. But there's nothing in Matthew or Luke to say, yep, that's it. So, if we want to know the exact date, is that we have to go outside of Matthew and Luke and turn to the book of Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his head. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was to be born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. Did you catch it? No? That's fine. We'll break this down working backwards from verse 5. We know that the man-child who is to rule with a rod of iron is Jesus, because earlier in Revelation, Jesus said that he will give others the same privilege that he received, and in chapter 19, John described Jesus' second coming by applying Psalm 2 to him, that we know is connected with Numbers 24:17 and Genesis 49:10 because of the royal scepter and rod language that's in there for the messianic king of the Jews. So, verse 5 is 100% referring to Jesus in the scene here. And at the beginning of the verse, it describes a woman bringing forth a man. This is a birth reference because in verse 2, it explicitly said that she was pregnant and about to give birth to the child. Now, look at the last part of verse 4 again. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was to be born. You can clearly hear the reference to Herod's massacre of the innocent in Matthew 2 here. And the other historical reference that occurs here is at the end of verse 5 saying that the child was caught up unto God to sit on his throne. This is clearly describing Jesus' ascension after his resurrection. So, John is clearly talking about Jesus' birth here. Now, how we can arrive at the exact birth date is by going back to verse 1 and recognizing that John is seeing celestial signage at work here because he continues in the verse describing the woman being clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. You will read in any star atlas, like Norton's, that there are 12 visible stars around Virgo's head. So, when John says he sees the sun, moon, and stars, that's exactly what he means with those outer space objects. And as such, he is referring to the only female constellation on the zodiac, the constellation Virgo, the Virgin. John is having a similar experience here as to that of Daniel's when he saw the ram and goat astronomical signage of the Persian and Greek empires going to war with one another. As Daniel is to the Old Testament, so is John to the New Testament. And we saw earlier that the wise men got fired up after seeing the star move from the Leo constellation and came to a stop in the Virgin constellation right over top of Bethlehem. What's interesting as well is the reference to the Great Red Dragon. Astronomically, there are a few possibilities here. There's Hydra, that is on the other side of the ecliptic from Virgo and Leo. There's actually a combination of Scorpio and Libra proposal out there because the ancient Greek astronomy had Libra scales as the claws to Scorpio. That's pretty easy to find online, but was that combination ever referred to as the dragon? That part I could not find anywhere. But if so, it takes the zodiacal signs then down to 11, which seems a little weird when you start getting into the whole calendar discussion part of it. And there's the constellation Draco, the dragon, that could be the one as well. We can't definitively say which one of those three was the one that John had in mind, but since there are multiple options like that, that only means that the astronomical interpretation in Revelation 12 for the Virgo constellation is what John was referring to. And it fits within the book as a whole, as Revelation 5:5 plays off of Genesis 49 and Numbers 24, and Jesus referring to himself as the bright morning star at the end of the book. Both Revelation 5:5 and 22:16 have a really good chance that their root of David phrases in them are tied to the Virgo constellation as well. Romans 15:12 has Paul citing Isaiah 11:10 with the root of Jesse. This connects us right back to the messianic branch language in Isaiah 11 and all the other ones that were translated into Anatole in the Septuagint. Their connection to Virgo is very possible because she is depicted holding a palm branch in her right hand and grain in her left. The brightest star, Spica, means an ear of grain in Latin, and you can find Jewish traditions that connect the story of Ruth with the Virgo constellation. And remember that, Ruth was ultimately, an ancestor of King David, and then you go all the way down to Jesus. Now, taking a look at Spica's name in the Stellarium software is that you see that the double star is also referred to as Azamek in Arabic. Now, according to Bollinger, is that Al-Zamak means branch. So basically, you have Virgo holding a branch, in essence, in each hand. Seiss agrees with Bollinger that one of Spica's Arabic names means branch. Ultimately, all of the astronomical signage being discussed here is referring to real celestial events as was seen in Matthew 2. So, all we need to do is to look in September of 3 BC to see if the sun was clothing the Virgin and if the moon was at her feet in our astronomy software. Now, starting back in August, is that you can see that the sun is currently in Leo, and as we start going by days, is that it is going along the ecliptic, and right about on August 23rd is that we entered into the Virgo constellation. Now, we're looking for that mid-body form, which, would be kind of like the clothing of the Virgo constellation. Now, this, from what I've read, takes place between 150 to 170 degrees along the ecliptic. And when you look up here, we're at 146. And that going forward by just 4 more days, is that we are now in that 150th degree window. And that this window is going to roughly last about 20 days. And you can see that it takes us right up until September 15th. September 16th just goes right over, so basically along that time. But as you can see, is that this is right at the same time as our first conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus in Leo. So this already shows us that we are tracking correctly on what John was describing in Revelation 12. Now, all we need to do is find the moon under her feet during this 20-day span as it needs to be positioned, roughly in that last 7 degrees of the constellation before it goes into Libra down here. So let's click off of the sun and go back to August 26th. And, for the sake of thoroughness, I'm just going to scroll by hour here. And as you can see is that we don't have the moon in our window right now. And that this actually the moon that is, won't appear until we come to September 4th. Now, we keep going by the hours that you can see the moon kind of roughly going with the ecliptic, same as the sun does. And there it is in Leo. But you can see it's starting to move further down Virgo now. Here we are at September 9th. And the moon's getting pretty close there. And right about there, we can see that the moon is now positioned under her feet. The moon is still in the Virgo constellation. And if we go 2 more hours, it still is in Virgo. But just at the change into September 12th is that it's now entered into the Libra constellation. And so, if you didn't catch it, is that roughly at 6 p.m., at the change of the day according to the Jewish calendar, is that Jesus was born on 9/11, right at or after 6 p.m. This matches Luke's description that the shepherds were out at night when an angel appeared to them and said that their Messiah had been born this day. By night and this day reminds us that the Jewish day began in the evening at 6 p.m. And noticing that we have a crescent moon here being under her feet means that this is also a change in the Jewish months. This is significant because on September 11th, 3 BC at sundown is Tishri 1, also known as Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. This holiday is known as the Day of Trumpets, and it is also associated with the dead, is that it became the precursor to the idea of the resurrection of the dead at the eschaton. 9 days later, after the Jewish New Year, is the Day of Atonement, with also the Festival of Booths happening just 5 days after this for a week. This is likely what Paul was alluding to in 1 Corinthians 15:52, with the dead rising at the sound of the last trumpet. Outside of the trumpets is that this day was also a day of shouting and praising of Yahweh in heaven, which offers a little more insight into Luke's story, as numerous angels were described praising God upon Jesus' birth. This idea carried into Rabbinic Judaism, as seen in our earlier reference about the tradition of the patriarchs being born and dying on the same day. And some of them said that this happened in Tishri for all the patriarchs, along with other key events like creation, Joseph's release from prison in Genesis 41:1, and his installment as the second authority over all of Egypt. And also that the world is expected to end in Tishri with the coming of the Messiah. Rabbis would get this idea from the flood story, as the waters dried up and the world had been officially cleansed and rebooted on Tishri 1. Now, I can imagine some of you are thinking, yeah, but it says the first month, first day, not the 7th month. True, but that gets reconciled in Exodus 12 with the institution of Passover, as God shifted the calendar by 6 months. It wasn't until the exile that the name of the months were adopted in. Before that, they were just all numeric. So, at the first Passover, God said that the 7th month is now the first month. So, the world was completely cleansed on Tishri 1, which makes a lot of sense if God created it on that day, or as in some rabbinic traditions say that Adam and Eve were created on that day, so day 6 was Tishri 1 to them. But the flood narrative also began to be known as Noah's birthday, because Genesis 7:11 says that Noah was 600 when the flood started, but 601 when the flood finished on Tishri 1. So since Noah was seen as a redeemer of the world, is that concept also fed into the expectation of the Messiah's arrival, i.e. his birth, in Tishri 1 as well. It also became the day that Israel, when it was united and later divided off as southern Judah, inaugurated their kings, and held their final coronation ceremony, as seen with Solomon, Jehu, and Joash. So there's a lot of background information that we can appreciate even more now in the Lucan account, and see that John picked up on all of that and gave us the exact day and 20-minute window for Jesus' birth. Simeon, at Jesus' temple presentation, might have been tracking on this as well by saying that Jesus' coming was demonstrated in a manner that all people could see, and he recognized it while referring to Jesus as the light to the Gentiles and glory of Israel. Paul most assuredly picked up on this astronomical signage when addressing the Romans right after a very famous verse. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Paul follows this up by answering a really important question. But what about the rest of Israel who haven't heard about the Messiah and his coming? He says that in fact they knew and should have known, because his scriptural support to this claim was to say, "Yes, verily, their sound went into all the earth, and their words unto the ends of the world." He quotes Psalm 19:4 as his proof, where we saw earlier the clear astronomical language in the psalm. All of this debunks any critic's notion about a so-called New Testament silence on Jesus' birth outside of Matthew and Luke, because all of them, in some fashion, point to September 11th, 3 BC as the birth date, with a ton of Old Testament support coming over hundreds and hundreds of years in advance that can all be scientifically proven now. So, if you're someone whose worldview is solely rooted in scientific materialism, with the whole idea that the whole cosmos started from a singularity point no bigger than the tip of a pen, and then it expanded over billions of years, leading to the formation of trillions of stars, with their given planetary orbits and rotations, with no governing agent or creator behind them, please take the time and try and reconcile that worldview with everything that is shown to be both astronomically and historically true surrounding Jesus' birth on the Jewish New Year on September 11th, 3 BC, and Jupiter's apparent retrograde motion that stopped right over top of Bethlehem on December 25th, 2 BC in the Virgin constellation. I'm sorry, but you know deep down that this is not possible unless a divine creator had ordained everything into existence, and in such a way that all of these events would unfold the way they did. And as such, affirms that the God of the Bible is the one true eternal creator, whose desire is for you to seek him and perhaps reach out for him and to find him, though he is not far from each one of us, as the heavens declare the glory of God. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.